Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Build Consulting webinar for April 2020 titled Change Management for Changing Times. Today, I'll be introducing some key concepts to inform how to conduct your business and technology change efforts. We had over 65 registrants for this webinar, and I see we have currently about 21 attending live, and several questions submitted, which I will try to address in the course of this webinar. And please feel free to submit any questions you have as the presentation moves along using the Q&A feature in the Zoom toolbar, or you can do that at any time during the presentation or during the Q&A at the end. And you'll also have access near the conclusion of the webinar to my personal contact information for any follow-ups that you'd like to send my way. My name is Peter Mirus, and I'm a partner at Build Consulting and your presenter for this webinar. Just a little bit about myself by the numbers. I have 20 years serving all manner of nonprofit organizations ranging in size from small or local to enterprise-sized global organizations and across a wide variety of industry categories and mission orientations. And over the past 8 years, I've worked exclusively with nonprofit organizations. Over the course of my career in total, I've worked with about 120 clients now in both the nonprofit, government, and for-profit spaces. And I have three primary areas of expertise, which are marketing, constituent relationship management writ large, as big as you can think about that concept as much as my coverage extends, and information strategy. Before we get into today's webinar, I'd just like to highlight for you an upcoming webinar that we have in partnership with Community IT called What Do Nonprofits Need from Their Tech Leaders? Technology leaders at nonprofit organizations come in all sorts and have all sorts of job descriptions according to the resources and the needs of the organizations they serve. So some organizations have a CIO, others an IT director or manager, and sometimes a finance, operations, administrative, or programs executive or manager takes on the technology leadership role. But what do nonprofits need from their tech leaders? Build Consulting believes that there are a few indispensable qualities or capabilities that all tech leaders should have, regardless of what they otherwise do or where they sit inside of the organization. And that is what we're going to be discussing on Wednesday, May 20th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You'll be receiving an invitation to join that webinar I think next week via email, so keep an eye out for that. Now a little bit about Build Consulting, just in brief. We're a solution agnostic firm that works exclusively with nonprofit organizations to help them make data and technology decisions that support their mission. And we have a collaborative approach that empowers our clients to make informed choices for their organizations. Build leads in the social sector by providing a variety of different services, but all our services are designed to help clients transform themselves to better serve constituents of all types, including funders, donors, program beneficiaries, staff, volunteers, board and committee members, and the general public. And we are very focused on transformation, which is why the change management topic today is an integral one to how we perform our work. And indeed, Build Consulting believes, and this is the reason why we were founded in 2015, that tomorrow's best nonprofits will use technology to transform themselves and the world. But there's a challenge that people need to think about before they approach technology-supported change, and that's that 50% of nonprofit technology projects fail. And by fail, we mean they did not achieve the intended business benefit that was that they were designed to provide. And the reason for that oftentimes is that the technology moves forward, but the organization does not. Oftentimes in today's world, there's a technology solution that can be achieved at a relatively affordable cost for most nonprofit use cases. That hasn't been the case in some prior eras, but it is today. And so studies have shown that there are many other reasons why nonprofit technology projects fail, and many of them can be addressed by better transformation and better change management to help support that transformation. This is a slide that we often share with our clients in a variety of different contexts. It stands for old organization plus new technology equals expensive old organization. And we just want to show this to highlight that transformation is critical to your success in achieving the intended return on investment from your business change and technology change projects. And finally, we believe that successful transformation involves, at some level, leadership and governance, operations, process, data, and technology. And technology is intentionally last, and it's placed so to indicate that unless you get all the things upstream of it correct, your chance of receiving a good return on investment from your technology investment is not going to happen in all likelihood. I'd like to set up today's discussion with you about change management in the context of this problem, that we make technology-related changes without properly considering the impacts on the people affected. And so we don't always get the results that we want. And here's an example of a problem from a client that we had in the past. Our fundraisers insisted on moving to a new cloud-based fundraising solution. They're still unhappy and not using it. It turns out the old system was not used because leadership did not set clear expectations for its use, and no fundraisers were involved in the implementation. So that's an example of one challenge that we've seen at clients more than once. And here's another one. We implemented a new system to capture receipts for expenses and thought that staff would be thrilled because it was so easy. It turns out that most of our field staff never actually captured receipts before, so this was added work and they are furious. I wish we had known that earlier. And you can fill in the blank from your own story. From your own experience, it's pretty uncommon that that nonprofit staff that have been in the field for any length of time do not have an experience of some sort of failed change or change that was more disruptive than it might otherwise have been at their own organizations. I think everyone has one or two horror stories that they could tell. So the solution that we would propose for this kind of problem is change management. And today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about change management and what it is and how to perform it. And then we're going to dive into a specific template that you can use as a tool to help map out change management efforts for your own organizations. And I apologize if you're hearing any background noise on my end. I'm at home today and the trash trucks just drove by, so we have that to enjoy. That should be over soon. My apologies. So what is change management? Change management is the art and science of helping people to prepare for changes or disruptions that will be occurring or respond to changes that are already happening. And I actually added respond to changes that are already happening for this particular webinar because, let's face it, there's a lot of crap going on in the world right now that we are going to experience as change regardless of whether we want to or not. And in our own organizations, that has taken many different forms, but one of the most common across all of the organizations that we work with is the transition to greater telework and all of the technology and process and communication style changes that go along with that. And many folks are trying to figure out how to sort of retroactively bake change management into a transition that they already had to make on the fly some weeks ago, and are trying to figure out how to sort of remediate the effects of that after the fact. So we can talk a little bit about that today. Change management is not making everybody happy about the change. It's a frequent mistake about change management. It's not about making everybody happy, but it's about making sure that everybody is ready for the change. Of course, we want everyone to be happy, but we're only generally speaking a fan of change in our own lives that we can dictate. It's just not in our nature, so to speak, for us to be as change tolerant as we might want to be or should be. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we can try to help make people happy, but ultimately at the end of the day, not everybody's going to be happy, and they might realize their happiness sometime after the change has already occurred instead of being really excited about it in advance. And so a lot of people ask, well, do I need change management, and what size of project requires change management, and do we need a change management office for our organization, which is a question we get from some larger orgs. And the simple way to answer that question is, if your change requires people to adjust their behavior in order to achieve your goals, you need change management. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be change management that's called out explicitly as a discipline in your effort. I mean, in some senses, change management is most effective when it doesn't need to be called out as a thing, when it's just sort of baked into the process. And people have a great experience, but they don't have to think about change management as a thing while they're experiencing that technology change or that business change. And change management is often talked about in a very wonky sense. There's a ton of research and books and theories and frameworks out there for change management. But we've simplified it into 3 relatively easy steps, and that's what we're going to be spending the rest of the session talking about today. And I hope that you get a lot out of it and are able to think about how to start applying this within your own initiatives. And just be aware that Build Consulting is ready to support you if you have any questions and follow up. We're happy to schedule a free consultation with you to help you think through the first steps for implementing a change management plan in a little bit greater detail. So here's the Build Change Management Framework. And there are 3 simple steps. You want to define the change, identify the impacts from that change, and then prepare for those impacts. This framework works regardless of whether you're talking about a very small change or an extraordinarily large change. We'll talk a little bit about that in some examples in a few minutes, but it scales very well. And one of the nice things is that it can generally be well understood at a variety of different levels by different people that are thinking about change within their organization through different lenses. So it's always a touch point that people can come back to, whether they're on the executive team or at the management level or sort of down in the tactical weeds. Even board members like to see plans outlined in this way when they're aware of major policy, process, or data and technology changes that are going to be taking place inside of their organizations as part of key strategic initiatives. It's very reassuring to them to see an organization frame things in these ways. So first, defining the change. Frequently, people plow forward into a change without being clear on what is actually changing. And so the goal is to write it down and be specific about what it is, and then share and gain agreement that that change is actually accurately defined. So gaining agreement means 2 things. It means ensuring that the decision makers and key stakeholders agree that this is the right change to be taking place, and for everyone else to ensure that they are clear on the change that is coming. But that doesn't mean everyone agrees to it, as we mentioned before. Just that they agree they agree that they understand the nature of the change, not necessarily that they agree that the change is necessary at that level. We can talk about how that plays out in actual detail in a little bit more detail later on in actual practice. One of our registrants asked the question, we're undertaking a major change at our organization, and is it important for everyone to be involved in the change management process and get on board, all of the stakeholders and impacted users before we actually start the rollout effort, or is it important to just get the key executives and stakeholders on board first? And I think that we often talk about change management starting with the assessment or the technology roadmap, or as early on in a system selection effort as possible, because that's where you really start to talk about talk to key stakeholders at various levels within the organization about the requirements for the system to be selected and what kind of change that would represent for them in their roles, and then possibly also to survey users in some way using SurveyMonkey if you have a broader group of people that you'd like to provide input. And that helps unite them to the process, the intention behind the process, give an opportunity to have a voice. So I would say that it depends from organization to organization and situation to situation, but generally speaking, you want to engage people at some level as early on in the process as possible at this defining the change stage. And the second stage really is to identify the impacts. So you want to identify who is impacted, in what ways, and how big that impact is. And these could be identified as either groups or individuals. And then you want to make sure that once you know who is impacted and how, you're ready to employ a number of strategies to ensure that folks are ready for the change. So, first, we activate leadership, which basically means ensuring that leadership in the organization are prepared to be cheerleaders, supporters, and users of the system or other changes. And it is important that leaders and executives be users, because it's very demoralizing to teams when their leader says, well, I have a bunch of important relationships that need to be managed in our CRM system, but CRM is really for other people to use for me. So they're sort of divorced from the realities of the system, and that can be a difficult message for people to swallow. Second, you want to determine who needs to be communicated with during the project, what messages and through what mechanisms. And then finally, under training and support, you want to ensure that the appropriate training channels and mechanisms are in place to train the users, and that if you have a business or technology change, that your internal customer service or help desk functions are prepared to absorb whatever new requests are coming their way from both a subject matter expertise standpoint and from a capacity standpoint. So now we can look at all three together. We want to define the change, identify the impacts, and prepare for the impacts. So there's a lot that could be unpacked from each one of these, and we're going to start to do that. And the way that we're going to do that is by looking at something that we call the change impact template. It basically is a 3-section Excel spreadsheet that is color coded to the different sections of the change management framework, focused on defining the change, identifying the impacts, and preparing for the impacts. And so this is just a PowerPoint slide that highlights the different areas for you to take a look at quickly and just absorb. And then we're going to actually dive into the spreadsheet itself and start going through some of these examples and working within it. So this is the spreadsheet in question. You notice that once you start using this, you can sort and filter by each of the different headings. And when you're trying to use it as a tool throughout the course of a project, that can be very helpful. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And I know this text is really small, so just in a moment here, I'm going to zoom in on the particular areas. So it starts with defining the change. And oftentimes that takes the form of writing down or naming the process that is changing, and then also providing a simple description of what is included in that process. And this is what I think about just in terms of level setting. You want to make sure that everybody is on the same page in regards to the thing that's being changed. And some organizations take this to a little bit more of a next level by adding a couple of additional columns having to do with identifying which constituent journey the process is in, and then what the process area is. So this is for more complex projects where you're thinking about things in terms of stakeholder or constituent journey. In this case, you can see down here, we'll see an example of this is a staff journey. This is a borrower journey for a loan application project. You know, there's a volunteer journey. Thinking about your different constituent groups and what path they walk through with the organization, and then how that divides into major process areas and then individual processes within those process areas. So that's an example that I wanted to provide early of how you could customize this and make it work for your own organization to either add additional complexity or even just to resolve it to a terminology that works better for your own organization. So for example, if stakeholder or constituent aren't comfortable terms for your organization, you could refine it to whatever term your organization is more accustomed to. So then as we start to identify the impacts, we want to list the group or the individual impacted. And it's important that if different groups are affected in uniquely different ways, then each group should have its own row. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But essentially what it means is that sometimes there's two different sides to the same process. So say you have a process where there's an expense approval process, as you see in example 1 immediately below. I have illustrated one perspective here, which is sort of the general all staff perspective. But there are also, submitters and approvers, and each of them have to go through and understand their own process, and that change that takes place might be different for each one of them according to their role. So you'd want to spell that out in the group impacted and have a separate, could be the same process and same process description, but a different group that's impacted in a different way. And now, in addition to describing the process itself, you want to make sure that you understand the nature of the specific impact on this group of the change. And then what the impact rating is. Now, we suggest that when folks are starting to use this tool, they just designate it into high and low. Just as a simple exercise. And you can make it as complicated as you want. We have some clients that go high, medium, low. We have some clients that have really insisted on going high, medium, low, and then having some sort of in between categories like HM for high, medium, or MH for medium high. So if you want to, and you could also do it on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is a low rating and 5 is a high level of impact. So that's another example of how you can customize it to your own particular needs. And then I'm going to scroll over to the right here so we can focus on prepare for impacts. So under leadership alignment, you really want to describe who is required to provide highly visible leadership and ensure that the change is successful. And as it says here, it can include members of the executive team, the project sponsor, and/or the manager responsible for this part of the business. You want to make sure that you describe how and when this group needs to be communicated with. If the group requires training, if so, what type and when. And under support, what technical or business support will this group require to be successful? And as I said, we're going to go into some examples as we move forward here. I've prepared 3 examples for us to review today. And I think I also want to just mention in brief that if you find this template helpful, a version of it is currently available in the learning section of the Build Consulting website, buildconsulting.com. This version that you're looking up right now is recently updated and will be going up on the site to replace the existing version sometime tomorrow. But regardless, next week when we send out the follow-up email to this to all registered individuals, you'll receive a link to the recording of this webinar, both in video and MP3 format, as well as a link to where you can download this template. So the first example that I wanted to step you through today is an expense approval change, and it is a relatively simple and straightforward one. The process description is that expenses will be submitted by staff, approved first by the department manager and then by finance. And in this case, we're going to focus on the, quote, all staff view of this process. That is the group impacted. And the impact description is just that it will now be fully digital for the first time. And it elaborates a little bit. Staff will submit their expenses and managers and finance will also provide approvals all in the same system. And then there is some notion of why the impact rating was assigned as it was. This is rated low impact because there are no policy changes and staff are generally familiar with the user interface because it is the same as the timesheet approval system. Now, some clients like to actually create a separate column for the impact rating rationale, which they would provide over to the right here, to keep the impact description and the rationale for the rating in different columns. I would say that's a judgment call. You can do that if you want to. It's something that some organizations will prefer and others won't see the need for. If you want to keep it simple, you can just have it all within the one column as is indicated here. And again, as stated, we provide the low impact rating to this because of the stated reason. And I think it's really cool that when you have gone through this entire exercise, let's say you're rolling out a new CRM system and all of the changes that are attendant to that, or even a new financial or ERP system and all of the changes that could go through all of the different processes for that, you could have a very complex template, filled out version of this template for that. And you might have, 100, maybe even 200 changes that you needed to document and plan for. And it really is helpful at that point to be able to sort by process, to be able to filter by impact rating, because you definitely want to prioritize your resources towards the highest impacts, the greatest changes that are required of folks. And so this becomes a sort of functional tool. And as a side note, I will also mention that it's really important that change management plans aren't static. You create them up front as best you can, but then you learn things over the course of preparing for or actually going through a system or business process rollout. And you have to make changes as you go. So it's important that it be a living document. And if you want, you can always do version tracking on it. Somebody chatted in, hi, I'm a research fellow and want to know within change management, which side outweighs more on the impact, the hard side or the soft side of people, the soft or people side of change? I would say it varies. Sometimes I can give you a good example. We have a project going on right now where we're rolling out a Salesforce-based system to over 10,000 users. 10,000 volunteers that are actively providing mentoring services to clients. And for them, I would say that the level of policy and process change is low because they basically are just moving over existing policies and processes into a new system and a new interface. So there is really a large focus on the technology side of the change and helping people understand that, but not really asking people to change their behaviors outside of implementing the same processes in a new system. If you're trying to undertake massive shifts in policy and process at the same time, as well as a technology change, or the two are bundled together, as is often the case, you can spend a lot of time really helping people to shape their perception of the organization and how it needs to function as a group of individuals around those new policies and processes. And so there's a hard technical aspect to that, but also greater emphasis on helping people understand the mission-oriented aspect of the policy and process changes and how that affects their perception of their own value and their performance. I hope that answers your question. So now we're going to talk a little bit about expense approval measures for change. So first of all, we know that department managers will need to understand the new expense approvals process and its value so that they can clearly and consistently reinforce it to their teams. So that's what needs to happen. And then the question is, how will it happen? And you can see here that it says this will be addressed at the June 4th managers meeting. And it's good to be specific about this. And some clients will also take the additional step of once these things are defined, they'll be converted into tasks into a task management system to make sure that it's a little bit more executable for folks that are managing the project. In terms of communication, staff will receive a focused email describing the change 1 month prior to the change taking place and a reminder email 1 week prior. And I'll take the opportunity to point out here that a lot of times communications about change that go out to your all staff type lists are buried inside of these regular newsletters. And we've really found that when you're talking about a priority change, it's really good to make the email or other communication subject matter specific as much as possible, instead of saying, here's one of 17 things that we included in this newsletter or internal roll-up for all staff. So that's just a little tip. Try to make them single subject communications as much as possible. This organization for this change also wanted to provide optional training workshops that would be virtually provided to on-site and remote staff in the 2 weeks prior to the change taking place. And you can read your eyes over the rest of the sort of methodology. I wanted to also mention here, if you're not already familiar with, excuse me, I had a scrolling issue. If you're not already familiar with WalkMe as a product, it is a cloud-based tool that is in the digital adoption platform category, or DAP. And basically what it allows you to do is embed walk through tutorials that guide users step by step through the performance of a certain process inside of the system. So it is a very dynamic way of doing sort of over-the-shoulder type training for folks as they're going through the process. And one of the cool things about technology like that is that you can often use it to help produce your knowledge base articles as well. And that the steps that you put in the walkthrough will also automatically create screenshots for you as you execute and export the steps, so that it'll allow you to easily embed a visual for each of those steps in the knowledge base article, which is helpful. It really can help speed up the creation of your knowledge base article publishing. And then they decided that the help desk will be prepared to address any issues user experience, and technical questions will be addressed directly by that desk. And then policy and process questions will be forwarded to the user's department manager and/or finance for resolution. All correspondence will be tracked on the ticket. So just another couple of points here. One is that organizations often don't define clear points of transfer or escalation when somebody gets a technical support question that is really more in the nature of being a policy or process question. That's one challenge that I frequently see. And so sometimes things get held up at the support desk or help desk level for a long period of time while people are uncertain as to where that question should go for a resolution and what the turnaround expectation should be for whomever is addressing that issue. Another thing is that once sometimes the issue goes outside of the ticketing system, it's impossible to track. So it's really hard to tell if that something gets kicked around, what desk, whose desk something is on. So sometimes a help desk ticketing software has the ability to have what they call light agents in Zendesk. It gives people who aren't full agents the opportunity to reply to an email and still have it tracked on the ticket. And that gives you a view into where everything is all the time without people having to change their behavior beyond just using email. So this is one example, and I was able to walk through it fairly quickly from end to end with the expense approval process. And again, we're focused on describing the change that's going to take place or defining the change, talking about who is impacted and how and to what degree, and then outlining leadership alignment, communications, and training and support measures for that change. And one of the nice things about this format is that you can always go back and when you're trying to decide what you should do for a particular change effort and say, well, what do we plan to do for leadership alignment? What do we plan to do for communications? What do you plan for do to training and so for support? And it really is just a good mental checklist that you can run through every time to make sure that you've covered your bases. So I think we had another question come in. Let me just check that real quick. I think we're good. So let's go through another example now. I love scrolling in Excel. Let's see if I can get it on screen even. So there's this example here that you see at the top of your screen called volunteer onboarding assignment. So this is a example of a process within a organization where you had a volunteer applying, a prospective volunteer applying to be a volunteer, and then have to go through some sort of onboarding process in order to make sure that they really understand what the volunteer position is about and what it means to the organization and how it's going to be conducted. So as part of that, there's a volunteer onboarding process area, and then within that, a volunteer onboarding assignment. And the description is that prospective volunteers will be assigned to the onboarding team members on a weighted round-robin basis. So that's just, again, a simple description of the process. And then who is impacted are the volunteer onboarding team members. And so here's your description of the impact. Previously, the onboarding team managers manually assigned to the prospective volunteers 2 team members. This process will now be automated to alleviate a bottleneck. So the challenge was that you basically had a bunch of volunteer applications sitting in a queue waiting for a manager to assign them out to individual team members. And now the system will automatically evaluate the caseload of all team members and assign the prospective volunteer to a team member with new case availability on a round-robin basis. and the impact is low, because it doesn't really affect the caseload of the individual team members, and they don't have to do things differently. But it just means that those assignments are going to flow out more fluidly now. So then once you've identified the process that's going to be changing and defined that and described the impact, then again, we're looking at leadership alignment, communications, training, and support for this. So in this case, we want to make sure that the onboarding team managers can help communicate the change to their team members, and they will need to be attentive to any caseload concerns arising from this new approach. And in this case, again, it says these persons, meaning the team managers, have already been briefed and are prepared to be responsive. So that's good. This is an example of how you can update or acknowledge that a process has already started as this change management impact plan was being created. And then you can say, okay, the change will be presented to onboarding team members during the May department performance management meeting, and reminders will go out via email the week prior to the change date. No training will be provided as no behavior change is needed by this group. And then the help desk will be available to address any technical problems with the case assignment process. And again, challenges that are not easily addressed by creating a better understanding of the process by the team member will be referred to the volunteer director and technical program manager. So again, that is the kind of pathing of support requests that you need to think about and really spell out in advance, and hopefully have a system to track. So this is another relatively low impact and low complexity change, but let's take a look at a third example that's a little bit more complicated. And this is for a housing assistance organization that ran a loan application process. So developers and other parties that wanted to develop affordable housing would come and apply for a loan to be able to do the build. And in this case, we have a loan application submission. Now, it's not an easy submission process like a registration form to register for webinar. This is a multi-step process involving over 100 different points of data collection in order for an application to go through. So this is a complex process with a lot of conditional logic and a lot of field validation. And it's being performed by property development loan applicants that previously submitted the application as a PDF form attached to an email along with other relevant required documentation. The online application process will be entirely new to applicants representing a large change. Now, it wouldn't be a large change if every applicant that was submitting an application was a new applicant, meaning that they had not previously gone through the process with the organization in another way before. But in this case, there are many repeat applicants. So people are going to be asked, here's this paper-based, or even if it's sort of digital paper-based process, and we're going to completely change it to a different online process that has online forms and online workflow. So the impact rating correspondingly is very high. And in this case, touching about 100 different institutions that were regularly applying for loans through the system. So as such, this represents an extremely robust change management effort, and you're going to see how to address adding additional detail that might not fit readily inside of this template, and then making sure where that detail is can be referenced. So again, giving the voiceover for those who are listening to this recording primarily. As this represents a major change for the constituent journey, key board members, the executive team, the loan fund leadership, and the technical assistance leadership must understand and be prepared to sponsor the change. So in other words, this is an all hands on deck situation from a leadership alignment perspective. And it says Loan Fund Senior Vice President Jane Smiley, a fictitious name, will be the executive sponsor and will take the lead on coordinating this alignment effort. So that is very, very specific, and you can sort of sense the urgency and the weight that needs to be behind this effort from leadership. And then under communication, this change has its own communication plan. See loan application change comms plan.docx. We will be leveraging all, whoops, this should say communications, my bad. We will be leveraging all the communications channels to support this effort. The communications team will be managing and executing this plan with content support from the loan fund and technical assistance. And in this case, for this organization, we had a change management task force that consisted of cross-functional teams, and the communications, there was a communications team member on it, a loan fund team member on it, and a technical assistance uh, team member on it, and they were integral to leading and planning and leading the change management effort from that task force, and then liaising essentially with their teams to make sure that everybody was on the same page. Same thing for training. This change has its own training plan. And again, it's an all hands on deck situation. All of the available training methods to support this effort. This might include knowledge-based articles, live trainings, in-person trainings, online trainings, recorded training videos, walkthroughs, and WalkMe or similar digital adoption platform as mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of different, 4 or 5 major training options or channels that could be leveraged for this effort. And then from support, the technical assistance team will provide support regarding the process, its requirements, regarding the process, its requirements. What does that even mean? I'm sorry. The technical assistance team will provide support regarding the process for applicants. So in this particular organization, there was a strong technical assistance function or field ops function where the organization was helping loan housing organizations that were applying for loans or property developers prepare themselves to engage in that effort. So it was logical that they should provide the support regarding the process for applicants. But there might be some technical issues with the forms and the process, and those would have to be provided through the help desk support, the technical help desk from IT. And then both types of requests will be managed through Zendesk. That's a typical ticketing customer service solution. We use Teamwork Desk sometimes. And the technical assistance team is staffing up by 2 FTEs or full-time equivalents for 18 months to handle projected support ticket volume increase. So sometimes it is going to be the case that a particular change, the response to or the change management effort will require staffing up. And it's important to be aware of that. You can't just smush new responsibilities constantly onto everybody's plates for both small and large change efforts. And I think that one of the fundamental flaws that I see when approaching particularly major technology change projects in nonprofit organizations is that the organization teams doesn't really do time estimates for people's involvement. And in the absence of that, it basically assumes that everybody's time is infinitely flexible. And of course, we know that's not the case. So a big part of more complex change management efforts, particularly, can be estimating the time involvement that will be required for individuals to engage in the leadership alignment, communications, training, and support processes to make sure that people are both on the delivering end of those things and on the receiving end of them have time to engage. In other words, managers may have to take things off of their plates or tell them what they can prioritize at a lower level in order for them to be able to participate. Because in absence of that, large scale changes, particularly like a CRM replacement or an ERP replacement that touch a lot of people in a lot of different roles and are big lifts, will cause a lot of frustration and a lot of burnout, because somebody will say, well, you're effectively asking me to spend 8 more hours on this per week, and I already have a 50-hour week. So that's a good recipe for a lot of discontent and burnout. So I've been through 3 examples here, giving voiceover to them as we've gone along. And I hope that's been helpful in you understanding a little bit more about how this process works. and what its impact would be positively for your organizations, and thinking about these things in a more structured way. One of the key questions that I get after introducing this framework and template to clients is, well, at what level of granularity should we define these processes and apply the process descriptions? And the answer to that is almost always you'll learn as you go. I think my suggestion to most organizations is, go through the process, get used to doing it, identify about 10 to 15 individual process changes that are going to be able to take place. See how it works for you, defining it at whatever level of granularity is most comfortable for you. And you'll learn by going through that process whether you've broken things down too specifically or too narrowly. There's no real one-size-fits-all answer to that. Here's a question. Since so much change happening right now cannot be well planned, do you have recommendations for how to adapt this process for our current conditions? That is a great question. And I did forecast that I would get to that. So I think you sort of go through the same exercise, being mindful of what changes have already taken place, and to itemize them, and then do a little bit of listening, or take the time to do a little bit of listening and see what impacts those have had and what will need to be remediated. I mean, I think the negative side of being in that situation is that you already have had to do things without the appropriate amount of change management, perhaps, or you haven't been able to spend time thinking about it because you had to make the change on the hustle. But on the pro side, you have the advantage of getting some experience about how that change, and done in an ideal way, has impacted people. And you just have to be aware that you might have to do some backtracking and remedial backtracking, and just be aware of how much you're asking of any one group at one time. So it's sort of like doing a post-mortem, in a sense, not to use too morbid of a term, but it's sort of a post-op report, so you can do a good assessment on what actually happened as we were going through this process, and using that to, and what changes were made, and how did it impact people, and then if we had done it from scratch, what approaches would we have taken in leadership, alignment, communications, training, and support to help people go through that effort, and then what can we do at this point of time to sort of backtrack and go through that process. So a good example of this for a lot of organizations is, many organizations made the switch to Microsoft Teams really fast as a part of furthering their telework effort, and really figuring out how to do that well on the fly. Same thing for adoption of tools like Zoom, even Slack, Chatter, and Salesforce, any of these sort of remote communication and collaboration tools. And so consequently, it became sort of like a wild west in a certain sense, because people are creating all kinds of teams or channels in an ungoverned way. People were just trying to do the best that they could under the current circumstances. And so the question is, well, how do you sort of rein that in, or walk it back, while still allowing teams to remain functional? And there are certain things that you can do to help out with that. But basically, it starts with the processes. You have to say, okay, well, what are we actually going to do with this tool? How do we get our mind around that? How do we want to function in this way? To what extent should the teams mirror the makeup of our organization on a departmental or programmatic basis? Really go through the process of thinking through what you want people to actually do and accomplish in those tools, and that is just defining the change. And maybe you need to sit with that for a couple of weeks or a month or a couple of months, and just make sure that you get everybody grounded in that. Define the change stage first before you even talk about how it's impacting people or what you're going to do to mitigate that. So I hope that answers your question. It's sort of a we're all doing the best we can, and we sort of try to introduce tools like this for changes that have already happened very incrementally, sort of get them in front of people, help people to be conscious of the idea behind it, help them to get comfortable with it, help them to make space for it, and then try to formalize it. And I often say, just chunk it out. If you're not ready to think about the blue and green sections of this sheet right now that are for the two second and third phases of a change management plan, just focus on the process. Just focus on talking about what is happening and what is happening in the tools and what should be happening, and really get grounded in that, and then talk about impact, and then after you've done that, talk about what you can do in the other areas. I think one of the things that this current pandemic has been helpful in is helping organizations to prioritize what's really important to them. I think for all of us and for nonprofit organizations in general, it's very difficult to put things on your not to do list, and there's always more things that can be done. And one of the things that I'm asking my clients to consider right now is whether they can do less well. And what I mean by that is, can you do fewer things at a higher level, and what is really important? And what can we take off people's plates to help make sure that they have the time to do the essential things, to meet their essential obligations, and to do it at a high level with the new tools that they've had to adopt quickly. So I hope that's a good answer to your question. If there are still some lingering questions, I'm happy to take it in an offline conversation or follow up with you specifically, Lisa. Thanks for asking that question. So we've got about 8 minutes left, and I'm happy to take any additional questions as they come in. That is the conclusion of the formal part of this presentation. Again, I'm putting the Build Change Management Framework up on screen for you to see it and have some time to absorb it, and maybe take a quick screen capture if you want to get it right away and don't want to wait for the distribution of the content when it becomes available. And then as I wait for other questions to come in, I'm just going to put my contact information up on screen here, so you have an opportunity to capture it and touch base with me if you want. You can also respond directly to the newsletter that was sent out regarding this webinar. That should go to my address either directly or indirectly. So if it's more convenient for you to do that, feel free. Boy, here's a loaded question. How do you engage leadership when only staff is interested in improving processes? I mean, it always comes back to leadership, doesn't it? Almost everything that we can do in our organizations comes back to effective leadership. So there are ways that you can manage up or help sell process improvement changes to leadership. And I think it always comes back to relationships, as almost every conversation about process improvement and data can and should. And what I mean by that is, your organization has a specific mission, and within that mission, it manages and conducts relationships. And it's really hard to sell or keep people's attention on process and data improvements if they don't tie into serving those relationships better. So one of the ways to engage leaders in process improvement conversations or data quality initiatives is to make it strategically connected to the relationships that the organization manages, and better fulfilling those the obligations or want tos within those relationships for greater mission impact. I'm going to be doing a webinar on this topic, yet to be titled, sometime in June, so keep an eye out for that. So there are going to be two upcoming answers to your question. The next webinar in May is the tech leadership that I talked about at the top of this presentation. And if you didn't join right from the beginning, although I think you did, you can go back and note the topic. And then the one in June is going to be specifically about data and relationships, and tying the two together to keep everyone engaged and motivated while you're trying to do process and data improvement projects, or while you're trying to sell those up or downstream from wherever you currently sit inside of the organization. So I hope that was helpful. Are there any more questions? So it seems like we're pretty good on questions and answers for right now. And so I'm happy to give you back 5 minutes of your time. Again, you can always contact me directly if you have any follow up questions or if you'd like to schedule a free consultation to just sort of sit down and kick around some ideas that are specific to your situation and your concerns. Thank you, everyone, for attending and have a great rest of your week. Bye.